Okay, I think the PM and now call on the LO.
Okay, I'll take POIs in chat, please. I want to give opening government an important wake-up call. The property crisis, the property bubble has already burst. China is already reeling from an economic crisis that has already crippled them in the status quo. I think the worst thing they can do right now is to tank this crisis even more. I want to begin by doing a few pieces of refutation, then I'll talk broadly about why this cripples the economy, it fucks it up in a plurality of ways, and why this is just really bad and not in the CCP's interests. So firstly, on response, I'd suggest there's other ways of raising funds for the CCP government to fulfill their interests. So for example, they can do things like being more careful with their domestic and overseas investments, because many of them are inefficient or ineffective. We're happy to cut down costs in these ways. You can do things like sell off more resources or export more in certain ways if you want to raise funds as well. But furthermore, I suggest the policies that they're trying to pursue under this motion harm the very goals that they think are so important. So, well, firstly, just on mitigation, I think if you raise tax on property, like maybe some people will buy property, but also given how many people are also really economically vulnerable right now, this is going to have a severe chilling effect, or fewer people are going to buy properties, which admittedly mitigates to some extent the amount of taxes you'll even collect. But more importantly, I suggest the fact that you're raising taxes on all citizens means that there's not only less spending, but more importantly in this context, less savings as well. And this is quite important, right? Because when fewer people can save, it also becomes harder for them to save up money to invest in their education, in their children's education, and training as well, which is needed for people to upskill and to pivot to things like the service sector and tech. So this is also antithetical to the very interests they think are so important and in the CCP's interests. But that being said, why does this actually economically cripple the country? Why is this not in the CCP's interests? I want to observe the problem that is in the status quo, where China is currently suffering from massive amounts of deflation and a housing crisis, which has already burst from a previous bubble, so the values of property have already plummeted to an all-time low. And just like notably on the response or preemption here, it's never going to go back to being at the same bubble that it had already had been. Like the fact that the CCP had seen the bubble burst means they're probably going to implement some policy safeguards in the future. But also, I just think like people are going to be more careful when investing in property in the future, because they're going to remember the bubble and the massive crash that has already happened in recent years. So what then happens when they implement this policy? I think this drastically exacerbates the economic crises and the struggles that China is already facing. But first, higher taxes means people have fewer disposable income, which results in less spending and therefore less circulation of money when people purchase less goods and services in the economy. And note how this is the worst possible time to do this, where even if OG taking them their best case, say they're going to phase this in, the problem that exists then is that it fucks with consumers' expectations, where they're already really uncertain and they're looking to the government to say, look, I'm going to give you some sort of like safeguard, I'm going to help you stimulate the economy again. But the government is doing the exact opposite by starting a policy and a long-term policy that says we're only going to take more and more money from you in the future indefinitely. And what this means then is this creates even more fear and even more caution from citizens who think they need to save even more in the short term, because even fewer people are going to spend in the future. The currency is going to go down even more, so it is even more important to save in the short term. So the expectations of future deflation also perpetuate this in a positive feedback loop, which only exacerbates the crisis. But secondly, I just think it's important that people need to buy houses and now are going to buy less houses when you increase property taxes. Like we already see a plummeting housing sector, which is not only bad for the economy as a whole, because people already hold a lot of houses and hold existing mortgages as well, which makes up a massive, a decent chunk of like GDP. But also just like when people are less willing to purchase houses, this is not only even less spending in the economy as well, but also just like individually hurts citizens who need the capacity to access basic housing and shelter as well. So we have that impact on individuals as well. But furthermore, I want to point out that the other reasons why it's really, really bad that there's less demand for housing means that there's also less demand for like land for property developers as well. And this is really bad for the exact reason they identify in PM, right? Where local governments, who are comprised, by the way, of CCP officials that are probably either the actors in the motion or an actor we care about because they can challenge important CCP members as well within the party, need this mechanism as a means of raising funds by selling land to like property developers who therefore build homes and sell off homes to individuals as well. But basically this is a funding mechanism for local governments that is important because they then take these funds and invest them or reinvest them in state-owned enterprises, but now they have less capacity to do so because less people are demanding property and buying property because of the increased property taxes and their own diminished disposable income as well. What are the plurality of impacts of this? First, I think it just like leads directly to CCP fragmentation as well, where like local CCP officials who are like often like part of like factions of like people at the top also are going to backlash because they have less capacity to use SOEs to meet their local targets. So for example, they often invest in like domestic projects or uses money to invest in their own like enterprises to meet like GDP targets as well, but they have less capacity to do so and strengthen themselves domestically, which leads to resentment and backlash for the people at the top. But also secondly, they oftentimes personally benefit from property as well. So for example, they oftentimes the richest and most elite CCP members hold like a lot of like the wealthiest and like largest quantity of property as well. And therefore, if you tank their property value, you directly really piss off the people that are really important to the party and hold lots of power. But secondly, I'd suggest that the fact that you have less capacity to strengthen state-owned enterprises by funding them more through local governments is also not in the CCP's interest, insofar as this therefore gives the private sector a greater capacity to compete against them, which strengthens the private sector, which also threatens the CCP's power as a communist government. Third harm economically. This also just leads to direct economic harms, and I suggest the CCP does care about the economy as a whole, not only because it's just probably just a value they hold, but also because of their geopolitical interests to use their domestic economic strength to exert geopolitical power. So, and given that we proved that we hurt the economy, this is quite bad then, in this case as well. Closing.
Yeah, so lack of land sales as a result of the crisis you talked about means that they're not collecting the money anyways. Presumably people own property now, so you could collect taxes from that. So this solves the problem way more than what your side does.
Like, yeah, sure, that's like mitigation, but the problem is that like you have less capacity to sell off more land to continue raising funds in the future as well, which is probably also just really important. And also, oh, by the way, like the problem here is that local governments aren't collecting the income taxes, which is also modeled in OG, so this doesn't solve the problem of like, local governments lacking funding. Third, or whatever harm we're on, I think this also just leads to massive amounts of citizen backlash because oftentimes they look to the CCP to give them economic benefits as a justification for communism and authoritarian rule. They say, look, maybe like the West can give you freedom, but we can give you jobs, and that's why you should succumb to authoritarianism. But now you economically cripple citizens as well, which is also especially bad, not only because you are literally harming them economically, but also especially because it's seen as a new and radical policy the CCP has not pursued in the future. And the impact of this is not they're going to riot and overthrow the CCP, but rising citizen dissent means it's harder for the CCP to get citizens to comply peacefully with their future policies and future attempts to control the population. You have less capacity to exert your control over citizens in this way when you have more resentment and more riots in this way. So for example, if the CCP wants to do things like force citizens to like comply with policies similar to zero COVID that are also in the national interest, it is significantly harder to do so when they perceive the CCP as forsaking them and failing to fulfill like their promise of giving them the economic stability that is promised under communism. For all these reasons, so proud to oppose.
All right, can you hear me? Sweet. POI is in chat, please. I'm glad DPM remembered this isn't a policy motion, because then they would have remembered that they needed to explain to us why it's like the CCP implements their policy in specific ways that they say. They cannot simply say by fiat, we will give redistributive policies, we will have marginal tax brackets, we will make sure that the poor people get their fill, if they're going to argue that we can also countercase. Like the motion itself means they have to explain why the CCP does this in good ways. So the characterization I take specific issue with, and we've been saying down the op bench, is the thing on marginal tax returns and easing other costs. Because I'm not sure they can assert this is how it actually plays out. The problem with this analysis is that elites are the worst hit by the policies that they propose. For example, they hold the most property, they have the most like marginal tax, they hurt the most by marginal tax rates and the things that they claim. They're used to not being taxed, and so they react quite badly because this is seen as an extremely oppositional push that the CCP is pushing against these elites. So the redistribution or fair application of that OG hangs their entire case upon to prove why property like popular backlash doesn't happen actually just doesn't really occur. I want to note, why does the CCP have to kowtow to these elites and care about them? Because the CCP derives its legitimacy from elite buy-in, because these elites have things like control over the media, over like things like services, over the markets that they have huge companies in. They have connections with international corporations and can direct investment within China. They have huge amounts of money that they often donate to the CCP. They have large social capital from the workers under them or the people who look up to them and things like that. These are the people the CCP cannot afford to piss off. In fact, most of them are already members or subsidiaries of the CCP as it happens. So you have to placate these people because most of them are already entrenched in the thing itself. So what happens? They make sure that the application isn't very fair. They do things like sidestep these taxes and pressure the CCP to allow them to do so. They do things like shout down marginal tax rates and instead push taxes upon the poor much more often. And they clearly have both the power and incentive to do this because they have so much power over the CCP writ large. So either one of two things happens on Gov's side. Either you get terrible implementation because you bow to the elites, in which case you just supercharge your arguments on why people are so angry and you probably just retain less money in the general case. Or secondly, you alienate the elites by somehow magically pushing this policy forward, in which case they stop donating to the CCP, they stop being involved with the government, and they get much more angry and much more like fracturing occurs within the CCP itself because a lot of these members are uniquely hurt by these things. I'll take OG.
Either elites matter to the CCP and the CCP caters to the elites, or poor people matter to the CCP and the CCP caters to poor people. But in both cases, the CCP is catering to the people who matter, give it the support that it needs.
Yes, so the point is you piss off both of these groups because you must cater to the elites, and so you make this policy in a negative somewhat way that helps those elites, and that pisses off the poor people, and then they backlash because of it. That's our whole case. So I'm going to talk first about the economic fallout, and then on popular anger and backlash, and why OO is winning both these clashes. Liz explains on economic fallout why the crisis worsens significantly. Look to her speech for all that. Let's talk about the Gov's main push is. It is that industries are failing and need to invest in these other industries to pull them back up to scratch. Gov is jumping through a lot of hoops here to get to a very simple impact. They must prove you implement this well. The elites don't fuck it up. You somehow make good investment decisions and know what to invest in, and that you generate enough money to make those investments actually work in the first place for some reason. Or maybe you could just use other policies to incentivize foreign investment instead. You reshuffle your assets, do literally anything else. And the point that we're making here is not that we're counter modeling, but rather if the CCP wants money and wants to improve its economy, there's a set of things it could do. And in the absence of this, they do other things. We've pointed to you in the 15 minutes of prep like 5 or 6 different things they could do instead that are probably much more useful. I imagine TCP can come up with far more better ones. We explain what this policy specifically is bad. The impacts to this are very clear. First, because it lowers trust in Chinese industry to begin with, when there's a huge economic crisis that spirals and a lot of people are out of the job, are unable to afford housing and things like that, and that hurts their ties to international markets. But secondly, the deepening economic crisis supercharges the backlash argument that we're making itself because it hurts your ability to pass and enforce future policy. The government pushback is on this backlash thing is welfare. We will give them back some kind of redistributive things. Let's even assume for a second they somehow get a good implementation of this, even though no one in the CCP will allow it to happen. Even if that's the case, what is their argument? It is we will take money away from the poor and then somehow give them enough money back to make them not upset about it, while at the same time investing huge amounts of money in other industries and doing other things within the world. I just think that's nonsensical. I don't know in what world they raise enough money to both give back enough welfare and give back enough benefits to placate the people who are already very angry and very upset, but at the same time somehow are going to generate huge amounts of profit to dig themselves out of the financial hole that they claim exists. I think the solvency is just not really going to work, and you just end up with a really angry populace that doesn't respect you and isn't going to follow what you say. I already explained why our alternatives are probably better. Great. Popular anger and backlash. The key premise that we need to prove here is that there's a large amount of discontent and unrest uniquely within China right now. Things because of the aftermath of COVID-19, for example, the housing crisis existing, the loss of dominance in international politics and markets. The CCP derives a lot of its power from popular buy-in. The biggest priority the CCP has then is to stop people from acting on dissent via protests and etc. Let's be clear, some amount of general discontent will always exist and is always fine. What we're explaining is that this policy uniquely is the tipping point causing huge amounts of waves and huge amounts of backlash and protest, specifically because it's collective, because it affects everybody in a really strong, really intense way, and therefore there is now the collective action push that the CCP truly fears. Now people get together in the streets and say, my taxes were raised and so were his and so were hers, and so we all push back together. And that's the worst fear the CCP has. Why does this uniquely anger the widest group of people on their side of the house? First, because people at the bottom are absolutely screwed by this in a million different ways that Liz already explains. This affects everyone and it allows the building of collective action. But secondly, it's really hard to rationalize immediate shocks and change because that's the Gov solvency they claim. That the CCP will just say, oh, we're doing the best for our people and you'll get benefits back eventually, and we can rationalize this under the Chinese principle of collectivism and being good for people. The problem, those rationales don't work when people can't put food on the table, when they face an immediate shock that's new to them, when suddenly some of their paycheck is gone that used to be there before, when suddenly there's a new form of tax altogether that didn't exist previously. It is hard for people to conceptualize these things as anything but being screwed over by the government, as anything but being betrayed by the CCP and the people around them. And especially, I think, because people are likely to be angry already because of the current instability, that supercharges the likelihood of this. So you get some amount of protest, some amount of anger. And I want to note, the like the actual impact of that protest and anger is that it feeds in more protest and anger and resentment. Because as people see other people standing up to the CCP, all you need is a small group to initially be angry to then capitalize on the discontent and anger of everyone else. That's the worst case scenario. It's also the most likely scenario for government on their side. The impacts of this are fairly simple. First, that backlash and riots cost money and social capital to quell. They do things like lower foreign investment and partnership when people perceive you as unstable. They necessitate concessions down the line to make people happy again, which just takes more money out of the CCP's coffers and damages them perceptually. But secondly, the huge impact is fracturing. First, because angry elites, for all the reasons I already told you, are likely to push back against the CCP or otherwise undermine the current CCP when they do this policy that's against them. But secondly, because angry people at the bottom just push back and cause huge amounts of instability within the government. This is what the CCP cares most about. Party hegemony is a prerequisite to geopolitical power, to economic stability, whatever you want. Government has managed to pick the one policy that pisses off both the elites and the common man, and for doing so, they've lost this debate.
Okay, I think DLO will call on member of government.
All right. Cool. Yeah. I'm taking PY roughly around 4 or 5 minutes. I'll be taking it audibly. I won't be looking in chat. Okay, cool. All right. I'm gonna be starting in 3, 2, 1. What the front half misses in this debate is very clear. China has already engaged in all sorts of actions to deal with their deflationary crisis, to deal with their slow growth, looking like decreasing all sort of taxes and increasing spending. I'll get into that mechanization a little bit further in case you don't believe me at face value. But the problem is you can't sustain this type of policy forever. We're going to forge you a really simple case. We're going to say that this is a good action for the long-term interest of China. The long term is what matters most and is what is most detrimental to China's stability, and therefore we're going to take this round. I'm going to do a couple pieces of framing before I get into there. The first thing is I want to characterize why specifically long-term is uniquely important to the CCP. The first thing is that the CCP has complete control. That is, they have a lot of mediums and ability to quell unrest, to deal with any kinds of issues that arise. Things like propaganda, technology, non-independent media, the bureaucrats they stack at all levels of government. So what this suggests is that the threats of immediate instability are not enough, but rather the only thing that could really deal a huge blow to China is long-term instability that is created by not meeting the most important part of their mandate. What is that mandate? Their mandate is a simple contract. We're going to be authoritarian, but we're going to maintain the economic good and growth of China. So it's only when in the long term you're not able to sustain that, where people start having thoughts, cracks, sustained periods of unrest, that is when you get issues, and that is a result of having bad short-termist economic policy for like at the harm of the long term that you have. The second thing is that we probably can see that increasing taxes is what it is. People might have some less disposable income, slow down the economy in some ways. What we will suggest is we roughly agree that there's some kind of middle ground between opening government, opening opposition. That is, there was a deflationary crisis and slower growth, but some of it has already been addressed, which means that the slowdown is not going to lead to this, like all these harms that we hear of opening opposition, to the extent that the government already fueled a lot of money and injected a lot of money into the economy. So to that extent, lastly, I'd say you shouldn't be concerned with all the issues that we hear out of opening half. I don't know why they're making this debate about controlling rich elites, which already have maximal control, and the margin of change is very little. When, for example, you already offer them things like preferential treatment and contracts. Yeah, they might be upset at some of your economic policies, but it's definitely not nearly going to be enough to outweigh all the benefits they get from government. This is an econ debate, not their policy debate. So let's get into my speech. The first thing I want to talk about is why China's had slow growth and deflationary crisis. The first piece of analysis here is that the post-pandemic recovery has been slower than expected, and it's led to weak consumer confidence and reduced spending. That is, there's been weak internal domestic demand, and there's been weak external demand from all the products for various amounts of reasons that we heard, whether it's like the decoupling of the supply chains and everything else. The second part about this deflationary or slow growth crisis is that there's been an overcapacity issue. That is, it's not about what opening government said about their mechanism about diseconomies and factories can't get much bigger. The problem is that these businesses have been making decisions based off of their own predicted demand that was fundamentally shattered when there are negative externalities that they did not expect. Like, for example, having the COVID-19 crisis or having the collapse of like Evergrande and everything else. So the real issue has been an oversupply. And evidently, when you have oversupply, that leads to prices falling and stagnation. So very simple, low demand, high oversupply has led to deflationary or slow growth. How has China responded over like the last 4 years? Because it's been 4 years. Firstly, they've increased spending heavily. That is, they've acquired a lot of debt in this process. They've been issuing bonds. They've been printing a lot of money. And this is all to fuel their spending campaigns in order to increase demand. That is a natural response to a deflationary crisis. This looks like direct transfers. It looks like government programs and infrastructure. What this necessarily does, this characterization, is deals a heavy blow to opening government's characterization about needing more types of spending, needing more infrastructure and everything else, because this is exactly what's been happening for the last 4 years. To the extent that you need more of this is very unclear as an issue. Therefore, they're solving something that doesn't even appear to be much of a problem. The second thing is that there's been decreasing revenues. That is, they've hatched existing taxes as a tool to free up more money. That is, the most important characterization that I mentioned at the start of the round is that China's already decreased all sorts of taxes and increased spending, as they've already engaged in butchering one after another tax, which means really what we're trying to do is that if we were in the middle and China moved to the left because of decreasing taxes, we're trying to move us back to the reasonable center, because you cannot sustain being on the left for very long-term periods, as I'm going to mechanize and explain in a moment. So ultimately, they decrease taxes to free up a lot more money in the way that they wanted to. So what this mechanization does is this actually addresses OO's POI, that is, or criticism. I remember when they said this, but it said OO never proved that there's a large budgetary deficit. I just did. This is why, structurally speaking, there's been a massive budgetary deficit that's existed in China and that you have to deal with immediately. I also think OO fairly pointed out against OG that, like, you could just spend money. You could print more money. You don't need to free up money. The reason, or you don't need to do taxes to get money. The reason why you're going to have taxes is to deal with the deficit, not so you could spend more. OG's case is antithetical to dealing with the crises that they want to deal with, because presumably you're going to be saving that money as the government, not spending it more. So why is all of this bad? The first thing is that you have increasing debt. With already high levels of debt, especially at a local government level, because of my, I think, fantastic POI, that I point out that these local governments aren't making tax collection through transfer anymore because of the lower demand that I just characterized. That means that you're not going to be able to deal with future crises, and it's going to make like future sustainability very terrible. These local governments have already taken a massive amount of debt that's evidently going to be better solved by injecting a property tax, because property already exists, people already own it, and they can pay tax on that if they're not paying tax on transfers. So as debt grows, so does the interest payments. Higher debt servicing costs can crowd out public spending on essential services like healthcare, education, infrastructure, and impedes long-term economic growth. Notably, you need a sustained response to keep demand going. An immediate increase in demand will not sustain everything. And then national debt could strain public finances in the future. The second thing is that there's a crowding out of private investment. Government borrowing leads to higher interest rates as the states compete with private sectors for available funds. Higher interest rates obviously make it harder for things like capital formation to exist, right? That means big companies being able to save enough money or get big loans to be able to make big projects to develop the government. Instead, you're getting less efficient versions of capital allocation. You're getting the government spending on weak, large infrastructure projects, which is obviously not going to lead to all the benefits OG wanted, which is the technology aspects of this. Ultimately, you also get some banking sector risk because China's already burdened with a large amount of debts. You get companies that get increasing interest rates like Evergrande that already collapsed that are not going to be able to sustain it. More collapses are going to happen. So ultimately, the long term is what matters most, which gets a lot worse on their side. They're sacrificing the early for the long. Why does long term matter most weighing? One, you maximize impact. There's a lot more people in the future based on current projections. Two, it's what will get you the ability to sustain your tenure. I told you why long term matters most. And three, there's a greater necessity on the ground. For all these reasons, I think we gave you a pretty clear cut, simple case. Ignore the confusion in front half.
Thank you, member of Gov. Call a member of Op.
All right, can everyone hear me all right? Cool. Please do POI in the chat. I will take opening around 5. If open doesn't have anything, then I'll take closing. Is anybody not ready? Cool. This debate has convinced me that everyone here has taken intro macro, but what has not convinced me is that anyone is actually familiar with China. China barely has functional credit scores, so I have no clue how DPM thinks the social credit system is real. We're going to differentiate ourselves from this debate by actually understanding what's happening in China. Unfortunately, to clean things up, 6 pieces of characterization about China. Number 1, China's already implementing fiscal discipline right now. They understand they have a bubble due to the fact they issue too much credit for things like consumer spending or real estate, and the government directly controls all banks. So they have told the banks, stop making more credit. This is good because the underlying cause of the bubble, which is issuing too much credit, which is a proxy for printing currency, is happening less right now. It means in the status quo, the underlying cause of the yuan deflating or there being too much credit is being solved. 2, contrary to what OO says, the bubble can pop more. Yes, in some rural areas, real estate's already gone under, but urban property is still expensive. Look at property in downtown Shanghai. A single flat is still 3 million USD, not yuan. This is really development for credit because the most of the money used for real estate development is in urban areas like Shenzhen, and the people developing this usually have ties to the party, which how they got rights to develop this land in the first place. So you can't freely develop land in China. 3rd, government spending in China is not effective like it is in the West. First, let's consider welfare. There is no federal welfare in China. The way it works is you give it to provinces, and the province give it to people with household registrations in that province. But the problem with this is household registrations is not based on where you actually live, but where you're born, and you have to buy someone else's. This means, for example, if you live in Shanghai, but you're not born in there, you have to shell out probably $300,000 to get benefits in Shanghai. This means that only the rich actually have residency and benefits where they live. Further, you can't stimulate economic development by stimulating industry, considering enterprises are always outcompeted by private enterprises in China, and it's the only way that the Chinese government is legally allowed to create industry. This means the direct investments aren't actually that effective. Plus, local cities already have unlimited money because they can always take land designated as urban and sell it, which means they have unlimited funding in the status quo, so it's unclear why we need the federal government to give them money. The consequence is more spending is both redundant and ineffective. 4th, only the federal government can tax in China, so I don't know what CG's case about. If cities tax, that is unconstitutional. 5, the Chinese government does not borrow money. They control the yuan. They believe in modern monetary theory, so when they want more yuan, they just print more yuan. Remember, they control the international exchange rate, so they can print and ignore most of the consequences because they control all of the banks. Cool. That's a lot of characterization, but there's a lot of weird stuff earlier in this debate. Now, really important and positive matter. Raising taxes in China causes China to have an insolvent debt crisis. We all are correct. They already have a debt crisis and they're doing bad because China's already over-leveraged. But the PRC isn't stupid. They're trying to solve this. But the problem is an insolvent debt crisis is way worse than a regular one. I'll get to that in a bit, but 4 reasons why raising these taxes cause the debt to specifically become insolvent as opposed to just bad. Number 1, it destroys the urban middle class. I do think the OO rightly points out this reduced spending power, but they don't actually understand the full mechanisms. There's 2 issues. Number 1, urban middle class is already over-leveraged because there are norms like, for example, that you must own a house in order to get married or own a car in order to get married, or that you must buy fancy Chanel, otherwise you aren't attractive as a woman. This credit was really cheap in China. People tended to over-borrow with the expectation it would be fine because they thought the economy would keep growing. Because for the past 2 generations, it's been 10% after 10% after 10%, so no one in China understood fiscal discipline. But more importantly, the people who own property are incumbents. You own a flat in Shanghai not because you bought that for 3 million USD, but because the Chinese government assigned that to your grandparents in the 80s because they happened to be in the right place at the right time, and you have inherited that. As a consequence, most people who own expensive property in China cannot afford to pay a 5% tax on that property every year because that is literally more than their income, especially if they're likely in a service job. This is a really big issue because this means you have a large set of middle-class people who literally can't pay their property taxes. Second, this decreases demand for urban service jobs. Pretty straightforward. People in urban areas have less money, they spend less of it. OO said this, but what they miss is the important mechanism that makes this really bad, not just a generic macro textbook argument, which is there was a Almost half the population of major Chinese cities are migrant workers. Not only do they not have residency, so they can't get welfare from the government. It's illegal, it's unconstitutional, but they paid a large upfront cost to move from wherever they were born to a city with the expectation they get a higher paid service job. But the problem is, when no one wants that job, they just spent their entire savings to move somewhere where they're not now unemployed and they can't get benefits. And now either they move back or they stay as an urban underclass. Either way, you have a massive unemployment issue in major Chinese cities. It probably also makes it less, attractive to FDI. Third, it causes real estate defaults, right? Lower demand, less people want to buy it, and if no one wants to buy it, you're paying that 5-6% tax every year going forward. Remember, these were built with loans that were taken before the Chinese government announced the policy, and they can't just sell them now because all its demand goes way down as soon as they announce it. This means that a lot of these loans immediately go under. And this is really bad because China's over-financialized because everyone believes these are systemically important and safe, but it's too late. They've already bought the derivatives on them. OG, go.
Most of this is based on like spec about specific rules that the CCP itself controls. It can just change the rules to allow itself to pay.
This isn't APTA, this is a BP. If I know a spec, I should win. Fourth thing, this lowers the value of the yuan, right? Straightforward. Why would you want to buy yuan if there's more taxes on it? This means it's worth less. This is a problem because a large amount of China's debt is denominated in foreign currencies like the USD. This is an issue because you already have a bunch of debt you are struggling to pay, and now the debt is more expensive in the only currency you have control over, which means on net, half your country's debt now costs 20 or 30% more to pay, which you can't fucking pay it off. If you can't pay it off, people are going to trust your currency less, which is a downward spiral. What's the impact of all of this? One, the bubble can pop even harder. It won't just be rural, it will also be urban. Two, even more importantly, you get stagflation. Stagflation is worse than normal inflation because one, no one consumes, so no one can start businesses to increase the GDP, and inflation keeps going up and there's no currency demand. It's way harder to solve than normal stagnation or normal inflation because one, the government can't make capital because the capital gets worthless over time due to inflation, and you can't drive demand to make the capital not go up so much precisely because everyone thinks it's going to be worthless and they'll save the money rather than spending it. Keeping China out of this is really, really important, and the only way to stop them from doing that is to make sure they don't go insolvent on their debt, which the taxes will make them do because it's private, not public debt. Proud to oppose.
Take member up, call on Gavwit.
Okay, I'll take POIs verbally, so please interrupt me. I won't be looking at the chat, so if you put them there, I won't see them. I'll probably take OO, or maybe CO. I don't know. I'll take whoever gets me first. I'm going to start by taking front half out of this debate, and then I'll deal with CO's weird extension. So starting with OG, I think they're correct when they say that if something were just a free way to get money, the government would probably already do it. If there was a free win of just raising taxes and getting a lot more money to spend on whatever you want, presumably the CCP would have done this a long time ago. I think the specific burden that OG misses, that Daniel fulfills, is proving why a crisis exists right now. That means that the money that we get from raising this tax is worth the trade-off in terms of perhaps making some of our citizens angry and the cost that that has to the economy, right? OG just tells you this is a free win, you get money, you can spend it on stuff. I think Daniel characterizes why China is at a unique moment of crisis and needs this money to solve the problem urgently right now. We're already taking it over our opening. I want to deal with opening opposition next. So firstly, they just flagged to you that there are alternative ways to get money. I think Daniel has characterized to you why most of those have already been tried unsuccessfully, but I'll just briefly respond to the two that they provide, namely getting more money through the BRI and exporting things. Firstly, on the BRI, this is a net money loser. This is probably not the way that you want to make money. Spending way too much money on the BRI is actually one of the reasons why China is in an economic crisis right now. But secondly, on exporting things, As OG characterized, like one way in which this tax likely manifests is that if you raise taxes on property and on income, you probably lower it on other things like value-added taxes, like services, like tariffs, etc., all of which actually encourages manufacturing and exporting. So you kind of kill two birds with one stone here. The difference is that we're now taxing assets rather than transactions. Insofar as this happens, I think we increase the amount of transactions of the economy. I think this is likely to manifest this way because this is how you appease the elites that controlled manufacturing businesses, etc., like OO characterizes to you. Secondly, though, they tell you that you're going to have citizen backlash. A few responses to this. Firstly, I think that this is worthwhile in the short term because we really don't have any other choice. If we put this off, maybe we get another year of happy populations, but if we cannot deliver on the long-term growth that China is famed for, I think we're much more likely to provoke citizen unrest than if we have a short-term economic downturn, right? People have dealt with those downturns before. Look at things like 2008, the dot-com bubble. There have been crises. This is like somewhat understandable, but if you have decades of consistent low growth, I think this is when you get backlash against the CCP. Their only mech, though, for why you hit a tipping point is that everyone is affected by this. Literally, they aren't. Read the info slide, right? 70% of people don't pay income taxes under status quo. Even if we significantly increase this doesn't necessarily mean we're decreasing the deduction. But even if we do, there are probably still like 40% of the population that don't pay taxes on this, that benefit from any additional spending we do. So you're still somewhat divided. I think this at least severely marginalizes this claim. Then they tell you, you like upset the elite. You probably balance this with just cutting other types of taxes like we've characterized, things that actually encourage manufacturing, encourage exporting, because now you don't have taxes on goods and services to the same extent. This might also stimulate spending. But even if you don't buy that, like I think the CCP just has a lot of control over elites. Like there have been dozens of news stories about the CCP literally seizing billions of dollars of assets from people who didn't toe the party line. Pretty easy to just do that and like delete a billionaire if they oppose you. I don't think that they're actually reliant on them the way that they claim. Finally, then they tell you that there's deflation under the status quo and make this worse. A few responses, right? Firstly, I don't think it can necessarily get significantly worse. The expectations have already set in. People are already pulling back on spending. I think that there are certain minimal spends you just need to make, like you need to buy food for your family or whatever. This continues on either side. The difference is when the government has more money, however they spend that, that's more money circulating. If consumers aren't doing it, we should take the money from them and use it ourselves. Okay. Finally, then, I want to just explain Daniel's case to you. He tells you that we have a debt crisis on our hands, that unless China pays off its debts pretty much immediately, we're going to see incredibly severe economic repercussions that likely take down the CCP in the long term, right? 4 reasons why this is bad. Firstly, the government demand for debt drives up interest rates, which makes it harder for private sectors to borrow and create business, which is very bad long-term for the economy. Secondly, though, I think that the servicing costs are incredibly high, like billions of dollars paid out in foreign currencies. It's better to get that all over at once, or at least significantly reduce it now, than have to take a massive GDP cut every year for the following decade to try to offset this, right? We also think, though, the risk of default goes up. You have more companies potentially not able to pay back on this. And finally, you're beholden to whoever lends you money. A big part of China's power comes from the fact they're relatively economically independent. If we lose this, we're out of it. Okay, dealing with CO now, right? So I think CO has a couple of problems with their case. Briefly, they claim you get stagflation, unclear why. Like they literally characterize you why spending goes down. If anything, that like leads to deflation, which we've already dealt with, but I think that part is out of the round. Dealing then with the rest of their case, a huge amount of this is just reliant on asserted claims about how China works. In BP, it's a standard of the average informed voter. If the average informed voter wouldn't know about these specific CCP rules, unless they prove to you why they're likely to exist, which they can't do in WHIP because it's too late, then you should discredit everything that relies on those premises. I think that we can pretty clearly take out a lot of their case based on that, right? But secondly, they tell you that you're going to have a debt crisis, that the urban middle class is going to be fucked over because they're over leveraged, right? And then also that they can't afford these property taxes. A few responses. Firstly, I think that like there actually is a bit of a housing supply shortage. This is why they have to restrict the number of people that migrate into cities, is because they don't necessarily have enough houses for them. If property taxes go up, I think this probably cools the housing market. Worst case, if you can't afford it, you sell your apartment, you get $3 million. Even if you don't get $3 million, you probably get half that. $1.5 million is enough to start a pretty fucking good life anywhere. And so I don't think that the crisis exists to the extent that they claim. Either you pay your taxes or you sell the money, you get a pretty big upfront amount, and then you go and spend that in the economy. That's a win for us, right? I think we cool the housing market, but also just think the CCP is not stupid. They're probably not going to raise property taxes to an unreasonable rate. The fact that like none of them exist right now means I think even if you have a 1% property tax, this is probably a pretty fucking significant win, right? Okay, dealing with more of this though, then I tell you that like they're over leveraged, right? And so this income tax is going to like damage families. Again, I think that this is a relatively small short-term harm. Like again, the tax is pretty marginal. It's like 5% per their own characterization. Under the status quo, these people are spending a lot of money on things like Chanel perfume. You could probably just cut that out of your budget and put that money towards taxes in the counterfactual. I think this is reasonable. Why then do we win this debate? I think we've proven to you that the biggest crisis facing China right now is a debt collapse, the inability to pay back the loans that they've taken out and continue delivering consistent economic growth for the next decade. We tell you the citizens of China have dealt with minor downturns before. They can deal with the short-term economic harm, but if we cannot deliver in the long term, that is the point at which they have common cause to turn against the government to overthrow the CCP. On the basis that we prove an urgency and we actually solve this problem, I think it's a clear CG win.
Think of whip, call on up whip.
Can I get POIs by raising your emoji hand? Or your real person hand if you want to do that. China is really different than the West. That's why Western taxation models never work in China and why they should never be implemented. Two really important extensions. First of all, we tell you that property now worth millions, especially in city centers, were generally given out during communism. There's an interesting response here from CG that the average intelligent voter does not understand how communism works. I think that's frankly ridiculous. What we're telling you here is that the owners of the most expensive areas are former government workers who are now elderly and are probably living off of pensions. That means that they cannot afford to pay back property taxes, even if it is 1%, because we're looking at 1% of $2, $3, $4 million. The only solution then is probably to sell your house and make an exit. The response here is you're going to get a big upfront payment. Obviously, that's not how this works. We're telling you that the housing bubble is going to pop, which means that everyone is going to try to sell their houses at the same time or sell their apartments at the same time, so they will obviously not be able to get the amount that the housing is actually worth, which means that they're not going to be paid for the amount that is necessary. This means that elderly people now have no housing. This causes overcrowding in the houses that can be kept, probably moving in with your children, for example, and this causes the gentrification of neighborhoods being turned into probably office spaces being used by international corporations, and the further crowding out of migrant workers who are then even further crowded out by the new elderly people who have to find new places to live in like the outskirts of the city. And this means that migrant workers can't move into the cities, and now they can't keep their jobs because which they were moving into these cities for and giving up their welfare in the first place. That's our first extension. No, thank you. The second extension, as well, which I think goes completely unresponded to, is that there is a problem in China where some companies took out loans to build a lot of housing and now are having a really hard time selling it. This is a gross oversimplification, but it's the housing bubble. The closing opposition case here is really simple. When you introduce a property tax, the developers who currently own the buildings will have to pay an income tax. This expense was never calculated in the initial investment, and it is quite large because property tax, as we tell you, is based on property value, which, as we tell you, is inflated due to the bubble. For developers already barely staying above board, operating on shoestring budgets, that is simply too much. These developers will end up failing and will not be able to repay the debts they took out to build these buildings. This means that one, people never get the homes that they probably already put investment money into, which means that individuals like no longer have housing and lose all their money. And two, the banks that gave out the loans to these developers will fail because the developers took out massive loans and can't pay them back. This means that the banks who probably hold people's savings and people's retirements, for example, now will not be able to like pay those people back. People's money goes away. And thirdly, there will be a lack of trust in the market. Essentially, like people completely unrelated are going to pull out of like Chinese investments, including international investors, for example. This is a crisis. Basically, this is a crisis scenario that must be avoided fundamentally. Before that, opening had one? Yeah.
The CCP has arbitrary and arcane rules that make this new policy worse, like a ban on welfare for migrants. Can't they just remove that shit?
I have no idea why the CCP is inclined to remove the kind of policies that they've had in place for 50 years. You have to give a likelihood analysis as to why they're going to change their behavior in such a drastic way as you give by your own admission. This is not a policy motion, so you can't just like model it out. Okay, this is a crisis scenario that must be avoided at any cost. Yes, the developers are going to fail either way, but what we tell you very clearly is the CCP has managed to avoid a crisis and is letting these developers fail, but relatively slowly so that it does not affect the larger economy as a whole. This is what when these developers fail in massive spectacular ways, this is what actually causes the types of revolts that opening opposition tries to tell you about. When you no longer have anything to lose, that's when you actually take to the streets and take down the CCP. Let's talk about closing government first. Closing government says that deflation and slowing growth has been occurring, so we need to stop this kind of deflation. The key here is that deflation and the slowing of growth is fully necessary because the artificial growth is what caused the bubbles to be created in the first place. And it's probably what is going to cause the next one. This closing government says that you should probably save your money. I'm unclear as to why the CCP will start saving money, considering by their own characterization, they've been spending money in the status quo, which means that if you give them more money, they're probably going to spend it and cause even bigger bubbles. In response to paying back debt, they say the CCP needs to pay back their debt. The problem is a misidentification of who is taking out debt. It is true that China owes over debt leverage, but when I say China, I don't mean the Chinese government. I mean private individuals and companies who have taken out significant amounts of debt because it was cheap. Like, the Chinese government is not the ones who are developing the houses, it's private corporations. This means that it's unclear why taking away money from private individuals who have to pay back debt is going to make it so that private individuals now suddenly pay back all of their debt. This is completely unreasonable. On the long-term lane, I think we need to be okay with slowing down growth to like normal rates, because they're right that it's about going back to the middle, but it's about going back to the middle in terms of like no longer having massive ridiculous amounts of 10% growth rate every single year, because that's how you create bubbles. I don't think low growth is going to cause the kind of backlash to the extent that like the CCP's power is actually threatened. They don't prove a tipping point here, but I do think that if you repeatedly create economic bubbles over and over again, that individual people are going to suffer, and that's probably what matters. Let's talk about opening government next. Opening government has no inherency. First, they say the CCP will get lots of money. They don't prove the CCP actually needs money. Essentially, China already has public welfare policies. They have healthcare, and during COVID, they literally did rice distribution. Any increase in welfare is probably going to have a marginal impact. Why then are some people in poverty in China? It's because the existing hukou system, which causes an unequitable distribution of welfare. This is not going to change because you give them more money, because the goal of the hukou system is population control, and you can't just give up all your population control measures. The welfare goes only to the wealthiest, so even in their best case, when the CCP spends more money on welfare, it's just going to be taking away money from poor property owners in rural areas or poor property owners in cities and giving that money to the people who are able to afford buying hukou in China, in Beijing or in Shanghai. Let's weigh this. Even if it is true, first of all, I think the CCP has lots of money. 8.5% is already a significant amount when you talk about a country like China. The reason why it's so high in like other countries is because other countries are significantly smaller, right? So it's a net less smaller amount of money. But I think it's just unclear whether you're going to even make much more money, because they keep talking about how you're going to still have like marginal types of taxation, and you're still going to have high basic deductions. And most of these people aren't getting taxed anyways. So I'm unclear whether they actually access their like case. In regards to this argument about better control over billionaires, it is probably much better not to piss off the billionaires and cause the billionaires to like defect to the West or something like that. I think that's probably a much worse scenario. Just ignore them. But secondly, we already have perfect control over billionaires anyways, because you can like arrest them or like seize their assets. For example, China recently like got rid of Fan Bingbing was like the top #1 actress in China, and they just like disappeared her for a while. They can already do this, so it doesn't really matter. But look, their best case is the government takes money and invests in like the tech sector, but it's unlikely this investment is actually better than the private industry is investing anyways. First, because there's corruption, so the investment is going to be going to worse places. In the status quo, government investment is kind of a black mark on a lot of companies. They might not even want to take it. But second of all, this investment from individuals grows wealth from the bottom up, which means less reliance on the welfare system, because when you have like, you can invest your retirement investments into the tech sector, for example. This means that essentially the CCP is aware that sectors like tech don't work out well when the government is involved. That's why they allow private investment in the first place. What you're advocating for is going back on all the progress in the past 50 years of modernization. Opening opposition, I think we outweigh, because it's not about individuals of local government, it's about the developers that are aware of that have been the backbone of Chinese economies and are going to go away.